The clock ticked softly in the quiet house, each sound echoing through the empty rooms like a reminder of time itself. Margaret sat by the window, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands, and watched as another grey morning unfolded outside. The small town she lived in had always been peaceful, but lately, peace felt more like silence, and silence felt a lot like loneliness. She had lived here for over 30 years. Once, this house had been filled with laughter and life. Her husband fixing things in the yard, her daughter practicing piano in the living room, the smell of Sunday pancakes drifting through the kitchen. But those sounds had faded over time. Her husband, Paul, had passed away a decade ago, and her daughter, Claire, had moved across the country for work. Now, most days began the same way, with tea, a few pages of a book she never quite finished, and the radio humming softly in the background. Margaret told herself she was content. After all, she had a roof over her head, her health, and memories that still warmed her heart. But sometimes, when the afternoon sun faded and the shadows grew long, she felt something heavier, a longing she couldn't quite name. That longing whispered to her in quiet moments. It asked simple questions. When was the last time someone laughed in this house? When was the last time she was truly seen, truly needed? One Wednesday morning, as Margaret folded laundry, the phone rang. The sound startled her. It had been days since anyone had called. She hurried to answer. "Mum?" It was Claire's voice, soft but hurried. "Claire, it's so good to hear your voice," Margaret said, trying to hide how much her heart lifted. "How are you, dear?" "I'm fine, just busy. Listen, I actually needed to ask you something." Margaret felt a familiar mix of excitement and nervousness. "Of course. What is it?" There was a small pause. Then Claire continued, "I have to attend a work conference this weekend. It's out of town, and it'll be 3 days long. I was wondering, would you mind if Ethan stayed with you?" Her grandson, 16 years old now, taller every time she saw him, though those visits had become rare. Margaret hadn't spent more than a few hours with him in over a year. "Of course I'd love that," she said without hesitation. "I'd be happy to have him." Claire sounded relieved. "Thank you, Mom. He might seem quiet at first. He's been distracted lately. But maybe some time with you will do him good." "I'll make sure he's comfortable," Margaret said gently. "We'll have a nice weekend." After she hung up, she stood in her living room for a long time, feeling something she hadn't in a while. Purpose. She wanted to make this weekend special. Maybe she could cook his favorite meals. Maybe they could watch a movie or walk by the park. But then another thought crept in. What if he doesn't want to spend time with me at all? Teenagers were different now. Always on their phones, always somewhere else, even when they were right in front of you. But she pushed the thought away. Hope, she decided, was worth more than fear. That evening, she opened a drawer and pulled out an old photo album. The pictures inside told stories of another life: holidays by the lake, summer trips, birthday cakes, laughter. One photo caught her eye. A little girl with bright eyes, standing by the water with her father's arm around her. Claire must have been about Ethan's age then. They had taken that picture at a small lakeside hotel, one Paul had loved for its quiet charm. Margaret smiled softly, running her thumb along the faded edge of the photo. The idea came to her like a whisper from the past. Maybe she and Ethan could go there for the weekend. It would be peaceful, no distractions, no pressure, just time together. Maybe the lake could bring back something that had been lost between the generations. She called the hotel that night. To her surprise, it was still there, still family-run, still welcoming guests after all these years. When the clerk told her they had a room overlooking the lake, Margaret booked it right away. By Friday afternoon, She was pacing the front hallway, straightening things that didn't need straightening. She wanted everything to look right when Ethan arrived. She had baked his favorite cookies chocolate chip and packed a basket for the road. When the knock finally came, she felt her heart jump. "Hi, Grandma," Ethan said when she opened the door. He looked taller than she remembered. His dark hair a little messy, his voice deeper. He wore headphones around his neck and carried a small backpack. "Hello, sweetheart," she said, smiling. "It's so good to see you." He smiled back politely but didn't say much. His eyes darted to his phone as he stepped inside. Margaret's heart sank just a little, but she didn't let it show. "I thought we could take a little trip," she said cheerfully. "A hotel by the lake. It's not far, and I think you'll like it there." Ethan looked up, surprised. "A hotel?" "Yes, just a weekend away. Some fresh air, good food, no chores." He hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Sure, why not?" It wasn't excitement, but it was enough. Margaret smiled to herself. Sometimes beginnings didn't come with grand gestures or perfect words. Sometimes they arrived quietly, wrapped in hope and uncertainty. As they loaded the car and pulled out of the driveway, Margaret glanced at her grandson beside her. He was staring out the window, his expression unreadable. But she noticed something small. He had taken off his headphones. The road stretched ahead, lined with golden leaves and the promise of something new. Margaret gripped the wheel and thought, maybe this weekend will change more than I realize. The drive to the lake was quiet at first. The old car hummed softly as trees blurred past the windows, their autumn colors glowing gold and red beneath the afternoon sun. Margaret stole glances at Ethan, who sat beside her with his phone resting in his lap. He wasn't scrolling anymore, just staring out the window, lost in his own thoughts. "You know," Margaret began gently, "your mom and I used to take this same road every summer. Back then, there was a little ice cream shop halfway to the lake. The owner would give me an extra scoop because he thought I looked like his sister." Ethan gave a small smile. "Did Mom like ice cream?" "Too much," Margaret said, laughing softly. "She always got chocolate, and I always ended up with vanilla. We'd trade bites halfway through. That was our little rule." Ethan's smile lingered. "Mom never told me that. She doesn't talk about the past much these days," Margaret said, her voice warm but wistful. "I suppose life got too busy." He nodded, looking thoughtful. For the first time, the silence between them didn't feel heavy. It felt peaceful. As they drove, the landscape began to change. The trees gave way to open fields, and soon the shimmer of water appeared in the distance. The hotel came into view, a charming wooden building by the lake, with white balconies and flower boxes still blooming despite the season. Margaret parked the car and breathed in deeply. The air smelled like pine and memory. "This place hasn't changed one bit," she murmured. They checked in and carried their bags upstairs. Their room had 2 beds and a large window that framed the lake perfectly. The water glittered under the soft light of evening, and the sound of distant waves filled the room like a lullaby. After settling in, they walked down to the shore. The lake stretched wide and calm, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Margaret's shoes sank slightly into the sand as she remembered the last time she had stood there, with Paul by her side, and little Claire running ahead, her laughter carried by the wind. Ethan threw a small pebble into the water. "Mom said you used to come here with Grandpa." "We did," Margaret said softly. "Every year. He loved this lake. He said it made him feel small in the best way, like life was bigger than our worries." She smiled faintly, remembering the sound of Paul's voice, the way he would hum when he was happy. She missed that sound every day. Ethan bent down to pick another pebble. "I don't really remember him," he admitted quietly. "You were very young when he passed," Margaret said. "But he would have loved you, Ethan. He was patient, kind, and he had a way of making everyone feel safe. You remind me of him sometimes. Ethan looked at her curiously. Really? Yes, she said, her eyes softening. You both think before you speak. You listen. That's rarer than you'd think. He looked away quickly, a shy smile forming. Mom says I'm too quiet. Quiet isn't a bad thing, Margaret said. Sometimes the quiet ones notice what everyone else misses. They walked along the water until the sky turned orange. Then they sat on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the lake. Margaret watched her grandson's reflection ripple across the water and thought about how quickly life had passed. She remembered the years when Claire had called her every day, when they used to bake cookies together and talk about dreams. Then came the years of distance, the move across the country, the long silences that came not from anger, but from time slipping away. Margaret sighed softly. You know, Ethan, when your mom was your age, she couldn't wait to leave this town. She wanted adventure, something new. I think I was proud, and a little afraid at the same time. Ethan turned to her. Did you two fight? Margaret smiled faintly. Not really. We just stopped talking as much. Life has a way of filling every corner with noise. Work, bills, plans. Before you know it, years go by and you realize you've missed more than birthdays, you've missed moments. Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess that happens. The honesty in his voice caught her by surprise. You sound like you've thought about that before. He shrugged. Mom's always busy. I get it though. She's doing her best. Margaret reached over and touched his shoulder gently. She is. And she loves you more than she probably says. He didn't answer, but his shoulders relaxed as the last light faded. They walked back to the hotel. Inside the small dining hall, they shared dinner, grilled chicken, soup, and apple pie for dessert. Margaret told him about how she once got lost on a hiking trail by the lake, and Ethan laughed for real this time. The kind of laugh that made her heart ache with joy. Later, as they stood by their window looking out at the moonlit water, Margaret whispered, You know, sometimes I think places hold memories. Like the walls remember laughter and the air remembers the voices that once filled it. Ethan looked at her thoughtfully. Then this place must remember a lot of love. She smiled. I think it does. As they turned in for the night, Margaret lay awake, listening to the gentle rhythm of his breathing from the other bed. The sound brought her peace, the kind that comes from knowing that maybe, just maybe, broken connections could be mended with time, patience, and love that never truly faded. And in that quiet room by the lake, she finally felt what she hadn't felt in years: hope. The next morning began with soft sunlight spilling across the curtains. Margaret woke to the quiet sound of birds outside the window and the faint rhythm of the lake brushing the shore. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, only that the peace she felt wasn't her usual kind. It was lighter. Somehow. Ethan was still asleep, one arm hanging off the side of the bed, his hair a mess. Margaret smiled. He looked younger when he slept, less guarded. She realized how long it had been since she'd seen anyone in her family look that peaceful. She decided to let him rest and went downstairs for breakfast. The dining room was filled with soft chatter, families, couples, an elderly man reading the paper by the fireplace. Margaret carried her tray to a table near the window. She was stirring her coffee when she heard a familiar laugh. She turned, and her heart caught. At the far side of the room stood a woman with auburn hair pulled into a bun, laughing with the hotel owner. For a second, Margaret thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. But then the woman turned, and there she was. Claire? Margaret whispered under her breath. Her daughter hadn't told her she'd be here. Before she could process it, Claire looked up and spotted her. Surprise flashed in her eyes, followed by something unreadable: guilt, maybe, or hesitation. She walked over slowly, her work badge still clipped to her jacket. "Mom," she said softly, "I didn't think you'd actually come here." Margaret blinked. "You knew we were coming?" Claire sighed. "I did. The conference I mentioned. It's being held here. I didn't want to make things awkward for Ethan, so I didn't say anything." Margaret's heart tugged between confusion and affection. "Awkward? Spending time with your mother?" Claire gave a tired smile. "Not that, Mom. I just didn't want him to feel like I was hovering. He's been distant lately, and I thought maybe being with you would help." Margaret took a slow sip of her coffee. "You're a good mother, Claire. You always were. You worry because you love him." Claire's eyes softened, and for a moment, she looked like that same little girl from the photo by the lake, all heart. All hope. They talked for a while, cautiously at first, then more openly. Claire told her about her long work hours, how she was trying to balance career and motherhood, how she often felt like she was failing at both. Margaret listened quietly, every word filling spaces between them that had been empty for years. When Ethan came downstairs, he froze mid-step. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Claire stood and smiled. "Work conference, remember? Looks like fate decided we all needed a weekend together." Ethan's face showed surprise, then something softer. "Guess so." They decided to spend the morning together, walking along the lakeside path that wound behind the hotel. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of rain. Claire and Ethan walked a few steps ahead while Margaret followed, watching the mother and son side by side. For a long time, none of them spoke. Then Ethan said quietly, "Mom, Grandma told me you used to come here all the time." Claire smiled. "Every summer. I used to beg your grandpa to let me swim until it got dark. He'd sit on that bench up ahead and whistle when it was time to come back." Margaret's eyes misted as she watched her daughter point to the same weathered bench she had shown Ethan the night before. It was as if time had folded in on itself, past and present meeting at the water's edge. They sat together for a while, watching the lake. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It felt like understanding, like three hearts beating quietly in rhythm again after too long apart. When they returned to the hotel lobby, an old piano near the corner caught Ethan's attention. "Grandpa used to play, right?" he asked. "Yes," Margaret said, smiling. "Every night before bed." Ethan sat down, hesitating. "I've been learning," he admitted. "Just small stuff." "Play something for us," Claire said softly. He did. The tune was simple and gentle, a little uneven, but it carried emotion, something real, something familiar. Margaret closed her eyes and could almost hear Paul's laughter in the notes. When Ethan finished, he looked embarrassed, but both women clapped quietly. "That was beautiful," Claire said, her voice trembling slightly. For a moment, Margaret saw her daughter glance at her, really look at her for the first time in years. There were tears in Claire's eyes. Later, as they sat by the window, Claire whispered, "You know, Mom, I used to think moving away meant becoming stronger. But the truth is, I left behind the person who made me strong." Margaret reached for her daughter's hand. "And I let the years pass without reminding you who you already were." The quiet between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was healing. Outside, the lake shimmered in the afternoon sun. The weekend that had started as a simple visit had turned into something none of them expected. A rediscovery of love that had always been there, waiting for them to come back. And as the piano's faint echo lingered through the lobby, Margaret thought to herself, sometimes life brings you back to the same places, not to repeat what was lost, but to finish what was left unsaid. The rain began again that evening, soft at first, then steady, wrapping the hotel in a quiet rhythm that felt like time slowing down. Inside their room, The golden light from the bedside lamps made everything feel warm and calm. Ethan was sketching by the window again, his pencil moving gently across the page. Margaret sat at the small writing desk, pretending to read, though her eyes drifted often toward the window. She watched her grandson's reflection in the glass. Focused, patient, lost in his own world. Every so often, he'd pause and look out at the lake, as if listening to something only he could hear. "Do you draw often?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded without looking up. "When I can. It helps me think." "What are you working on now?" He hesitated, then turned the sketchbook toward her. It was a drawing of the three of them, Margaret, Claire, and himself, sitting by the water earlier that day. The lines were simple, but the feeling behind them was unmistakable. Closeness, warmth, belonging. Margaret's throat tightened. "That's beautiful, Ethan. Truly." He smiled shyly. "I guess I just wanted to remember this." Those words touched something deep inside her, a quiet ache she hadn't realized she was holding. For so long, she had worried that the bond between them had disappeared with time and distance. But here it was, captured in pencil and love. After a moment, Ethan said, "Mom told me she used to fight with you sometimes." "About leaving, I mean." Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes, she wanted to see the world, and I wanted to keep her close. I suppose we were both afraid of losing something." He looked up. "Did you?" Margaret took a deep breath. "For a while, yes. But I learned something about love. Real love. It doesn't vanish when someone walks away. It waits quietly. It forgives." Ethan went quiet, absorbing her words. The only sound was the rain dot later that evening, when Claire knocked on their door. She looked different, softer, more reflective. She carried 2 cups of tea. "I thought we could sit together a bit," she said. They settled on the couch by the window. The lake dark and endless beyond the glass. Ethan listened as his mother and grandmother talked. Slowly, gently, like 2 hearts learning to trust again. "You know," Claire began, "I used to think you didn't understand me. Mom, that you didn't see why I had to leave." Margaret's voice was calm. "I did understand. I just didn't know how to let you go." Claire looked down at her hands. "I always felt guilty for that. I thought I'd disappointed you." "You never did," Margaret said softly. "You made choices that were yours to make. I just wished I'd told you how proud I was, instead of letting silence say the wrong thing." A tear rolled down Claire's cheek, and she smiled through it. "You always were better with actions than words." Margaret reached over and took her hand. "And you always were braver than you knew." For a long time, they said nothing more. The rain whispered against the window, and Ethan leaned his head against the armrest, listening, not wanting to interrupt, not wanting the moment to end. When Claire finally spoke again, her voice was quiet but sure. "I don't know if I've been a good mother lately. I work too much. I miss dinners. I forget small things. But I love him, Mom. I really do." Margaret squeezed her hand gently. "You're doing your best. And that's what love looks like most days. Trying, even when it's hard." Ethan lifted his eyes and met theirs. "You both worry too much," he said with a small grin. "You're great moms." The women laughed softly, their eyes shining. Something shifted then, not something big or loud, but something steady and healing. Years of distance, of unspoken apologies and quiet misunderstandings, began to fade like mist over the lake. Later, when Ethan had gone to bed, Margaret and Claire stayed by the window. The rain had slowed, and the moon peeked through the clouds, reflecting silver over the water. "You know," Margaret said quietly, "when I look at him, I see both of us. The best parts of who we were and still are. Claire nodded. He's the bridge, isn't he? Yes, Margaret said. The bridge back home. They sat in silence, side by side, hands folded together. Two women who had loved deeply, lost time, and found each other again not through grand gestures, but through forgiveness whispered in quiet rooms before going to bed. Claire kissed her mother's forehead. I'm glad you came here, she said. So am I, Margaret replied, her voice soft but certain. Maybe it wasn't fate that brought us here. Maybe it was love reminding us it's never too late to say what's been left unsaid. As the lights dimmed and the lake settled into stillness, the hotel felt different, warmer, fuller, alive with echoes of laughter and new beginnings. And Margaret, lying awake in the dark, finally understood. Sometimes the hardest truths are not the ones we hide from others, but the ones we keep from ourselves, until love, patient and quiet, invites them home. Morning came quietly. The rain had finally stopped, and sunlight spread across the lake like gold melting into water. Margaret stood on the balcony, watching ripples dance under the early light. The air smelled of pine and new beginnings. Behind her, she could hear Claire and Ethan packing. It was their last day at the hotel, the weekend that had felt like a lifetime. Every part of the room seemed to hold a memory now. Laughter over breakfast, whispered talks at night, small moments that stitched broken years back together. Ethan came to the doorway, holding his sketchbook. Grandma, can you sign this? He asked, opening to the page he'd drawn of all three of them. She smiled. Why would you want my signature? Because, he said simply, this weekend felt special. I don't want to forget it. Her eyes softened. She took the pencil and wrote beneath the drawing. Love never grows old. It just waits for us to come back to it. When she handed it back, Ethan hugged her, not the quick kind of hug that children give, but the lingering kind that says more than words ever could. That hug stayed with her, even after he stepped away. Downstairs, while checking out, Claire looked hesitant, as if something she needed to say had been sitting on her heart for years. She waited until they were alone by the car, the lake glimmering behind them. Mom, she began quietly, there's something I've never told you. Margaret turned to her, surprised. What is it? When Dad passed, Claire said, her voice trembling, I blamed you. I thought you pushed him too hard, that all your worries made him sick. I carried that anger with me for so long. Even after I knew it wasn't true, I couldn't let it go. I think that's why I left. The words hung in the air like a confession carried too long. Margaret felt them strike deep, but not as a wound, as truth finally set free. She reached for her daughter's hand. Oh, Claire, she whispered. If you had told me, I would have held you through it. I blamed myself too, every day. But love doesn't survive through blame. It survives through forgiveness. Claire's eyes filled. Can you forgive me? For all the distance I caused? There's nothing to forgive, Margaret said softly. You came back. That's what matters. For a moment they stood quietly, their hands joined, the wind brushing their hair like a blessing. Ethan came running out of the lobby with his small suitcase. You two ready? He asked, grinning, unaware of the storm that had just passed between them. Margaret smiled. More ready than ever. They drove home through winding roads framed by trees still wet from the rain. The journey felt lighter this time. Music played low in the car, and the three of them hummed softly. The kind of harmony that happens not through practice, but through love rediscovered. Halfway home, they stopped at a diner overlooking the hills. As they sat by the window, Ethan began sketching again, his pencil tracing new shapes, freer ones. Margaret watched, sipping her tea, and thought how much a single weekend could heal when hearts decided to open. Claire reached across the table. "Mom, I've been thinking. Maybe we could make this a tradition. Every year. Just us. No work, no rush. A weekend to remember where we came from." Margaret felt her heart swell. "I'd like that very much." Ethan looked up. Then it settled. The family weekend packed. He declared proudly. They laughed together. Real laughter, not polite or practiced, but the kind that fills a room and wipes away years of silence. When they finally reached home that evening, Margaret paused before stepping out of the car. The sun was setting, bathing the neighborhood in orange light. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel lonely. She felt whole. Inside the house, Ethan placed his sketchbook on the mantel. "So we don't forget," he said. Margaret traced her fingers over the cover. "We won't." That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about the journey. Not just to the hotel, but through all the years between who they had been and who they had become. She realized something then. Love is not about holding on tightly. It's about letting go with faith that it will return. And it had. She turned off the lamp, whispering a quiet prayer of thanks. In the next room, she could hear Claire and Ethan talking softly, their voices warm and alive. It was the sound of family finding its rhythm again, imperfect, human, and full of hope. Margaret smiled into the dark. The lake might be miles away now, but its calm still lived within her, reminding her that healing doesn't happen in grand moments. It happens in shared laughter, in apologies whispered, in hugs that stay just long enough to remind you that you're loved. The unspoken had been spoken. The distance had been crossed, and what remained was simple and strong. A love reborn, quiet but everlasting.